you're not having that cooperation.
In my mind, it's often a social issue of people wanting power and wanting to kind of gain gravity and centralize this power. So it's interesting that you're saying it's more of a technological issue.
Well, these are techno-social systems. So pre-SQL, you already had big centralized bureaucracies, and they then picked a database technology that worked well for big centralized bureaucracies. And then after everybody's adopted the database which works well for big centralized bureaucracies, when you come up with the network, because remember, there's like a 30 or 40 year gap between easy access to database technologies and easy access to network technologies. So it's really 2 generations between those 2 phenomena becoming widespread. So the big centralized database-driven organizations are a continuation of pre-existing power structures, but then you get technical lock-in onto a database technology which is good for big centralized organizations. And then when the networking technology comes along and enables this migration of power to the edges, we get stuck because the institutions are working on technology that doesn't allow that migration to exist.
Right.
Right, so now we have the cycle of the system perpetuating itself, and a lot of people are seeing now that this is not the most efficient way of doing things and probably not the most fair way of doing things, and a lot of people are wanting a better system. So how can we get out of this cycle? I mean, for an average person.
This is really fundamental, right? It's about techno-social systems. The technology enables the society, and the society selects the technology. So what we're in right now can be seen as a tension between 2 generations of technology. An old generation of technology, which is the SQL database, a new generation of technology, which is the network. The network has a set of properties that support decentralized, improvised, rapidly changing, fluid kinds of societies. In the same way, the database is hugely supportive of a kind of, bureaucracy along the lines of David Graeber's new book, This Utopia of Rules. So as you get this kind of different culture with a different technology attempting to form, you get a point of grind between the network culture and the database culture. Database culture, one big centralized database, all your data goes into the database, we control and protect the database on your behalf and nothing will ever change. Curse and Greyface. Network culture, we've got a whole bunch of tools, we're constantly changing the tools we use, the data lives outside of an individual tool because you want to be able to migrate, things are constantly changing, you hate being locked in, and you think of, for example, Facebook. Facebook is database culture dressed as network culture.
Yeah.
You see what I'm saying? So once you begin to identify this, then we come back to our good old friend Ethereum. Ethereum is essentially a network database. It solves many of the same problems you solve with an SQL database, but it solves them in a way that is entirely about the network rather than this kind of bureaucratic centralized data form.
Right.
Ta-da! Right? And once the network people have a database that works the way that they work, you can potentially begin to move a whole bunch of functions away from database culture to network culture, because now network culture has a database that works in a network culture way.
Right.
Yeah. It's taken me only about 4 months of hard thinking to be able to explain that in a way that made sense. This is the first time I've ever gotten that to hand together. Thank you so much for the opportunity.
Oh, that's great. We've been trying to, for the last week or so, we've been trying to ask different people to explain how Ethereum works and why it's better, and to just sort of put it into layman's terms, because so far Ethereum, the way that it's explained is very technical. For most people, it just makes their head hurt.
Yeah.
So it's really great to have that explanation, because it paints a good picture, I think.
And, I think it's fairly accurate at a technical level. I'm talking about the cultural factors because it's easier to understand in those ways. But when you get down to the kind of brutal bedrock technology, the Ethereum code is largely about maintaining an interconnected network and coordinating functions across the network so that everybody agrees what's going on.
So what does Ethereum actually need to become widely used?
Ethereum breaks into a couple of pieces, right? So the description that I've given you so far is the description of Ethereum as a database, and as a database which is a networked database. Most people don't use databases in their day-to-day life directly. It's not very many people that will sit down in front of an SQL console and actually punch queries into a database. Even if you know how to do that, usually you would prefer to have some kind of tool sitting between you and the database that will give you the answers to your questions without you having to talk in database syntax, right? So Ethereum as a database is fundamentally not going to be something that you see an awful lot of people using directly. Instead, people will build tools around that database, they'll build apps, they'll build an ecosystem, they'll build services and functions, and people will then use those services and functions and apps as a way of getting things done in the world.
That makes a lot of sense, actually, yeah.
So Bitcoin was something that people expected to be used pretty much directly because it gave you an interface that looked a little bit like the banking system that your bank will give you. There was a bunch of accounts, there was a bunch of transaction balances, you moved stuff in and out of the balances, off you go. So Bitcoin itself could be broken down into 2 things, a database and an application. But because the 2 things were so deeply intertwined with each other, you can't really see them separate, so everybody just thinks Bitcoin is Bitcoin. But no, there's a database layer and there's an application layer.
That makes sense, yeah. So I guess once the applications are launched that are based on Ethereum, most people won't even know that they're using Ethereum. They'll just use the application.
I would expect that you'll see a sort of powered by Ethereum thing stacked somewhere on the page so people know what the underlying technology is. But other than that, I just strongly suspect it's just going to be like, here is Trust Chess. It's a chess client that's completely immune to cheating. Okay, great, like that. Right, great, Trust Chess. Or whatever it happens to be. But Ethereum gives you the ability to create a whole bunch of different applications running on top of a single database. So we all share the labor of running this big secure database on a single blockchain, and then the applications are written on top of that blockchain, and all the technical infrastructure that they share is free software, and the labor of maintaining that is shared across all of the users. So you get a kind of shared network database backbone that anybody can then write a little application to run on top of that gets the entire power of the network behind it. This is really beginning to sound kind of fun, isn't it?
Yeah, this is interesting.
Yeah. Now, what does that actually look like, right? Do you think you do sort of website stuff? Do you know a little bit about the web technologies?
A little bit, yeah.
A little bit, right? So, you've got a database, and then you've got some middleware written in something like Python or PHP, and then you've got a front end written in JavaScript, HTML. So, Ethereum, instead of SQL, we've got Ethereum wearing its kind of database face. In the middle, instead of using Python or PHP, we've got a language called Solidity. And Solidity is a scripting language which is a bit simpler in some ways than PHP or Python, and a little more fiddly to use in other ways because it's running, on top of this very different database technology, so it's a bit new and strange. But it's at a level of complexity that's akin to PHP or Python, and instead of writing to a database or writing to a file system, it writes to a blockchain. So it's a scripting language for blockchains. You write the part of your application that you normally write in Python, you write it in Solidity, and then on the front end, you emit JavaScript or HTML or one of these standard web technologies into a front end browser-like thing that we call Mist. And what you have here is a parallel to the web stack, but instead of it being a web stack that runs on a bunch of centralized servers with SQL databases, it's a web stack that runs on decentralized servers on network databases. So you get something that looks like the web, that feels like the web, that's not a lot harder to program or use than the web, but it's decentralized end to end. And we think that this is bad at cooperation, bad at sharing, and bad at change. And so we're locked into a social structure by the underlying nature of the technology that our society lives in exactly the same way that the early Americans were constrained by the technology of rail. If there was no rail line, you couldn't go there. If there's no API, you're not having that cooperation.
In my mind, it's often a social issue of people wanting power and wanting to kind of gain gravity and centralize this power. So it's interesting that you're saying it's more of a technological issue.
Well, these are techno-social systems. So pre-SQL, you already had big centralized bureaucracies, and they then picked a database technology that worked well for big centralized bureaucracies. And then after everybody's adopted the database which works well for big centralized bureaucracies, when you come up with the network, because remember, there's like a 30 or 40-year gap between easy access to database technologies and easy access to network technologies. So it's with 2 generations between those two phenomena becoming widespread. So the big centralized database-driven organizations are a continuation of pre-existing power structures, but then you get technical lock-in onto a database technology which is good for big centralized organizations. And then when the networking technology comes along and enables this migration of power to the edges, we get stuck because the institutions are working on technology that doesn't allow that migration to exist.
Right.
Right, so now we have the cycle of the system perpetuating itself, and a lot of people are seeing now that this is not the most efficient way of doing things and probably not the most fair way of doing things, and a lot of people are wanting a better system. So how can we get out of the cycle? I mean, for an average person.
This is really fundamental, right? It's about techno-social systems. The technology enables the society, and the society selects the technology. So what we're in right now can be seen as a tension between 2 generations of technology. An old generation of technology, which is the SQL database, a new generation of technology, which is the network. The network has a set of properties that support decentralized, improvised, rapidly changing, fluid kinds of societies. In the same way that the database is hugely supportive of a kind of, bureaucracy along the lines of David Graeber's new book, This Utopia of Rules. So as you get this kind of different culture with a different technology attempting to form, you get a point of grind between the network culture and the database culture. Database culture, one big centralized database, all your data goes into the database, we control and protect the database on your behalf and nothing will ever change. Curse and greyface. Network culture, we've got a whole bunch of tools, we're constantly changing the tools we use, the data lives outside of an individual tool because you want to be able to migrate, things are constantly changing, you hate being locked in, and you think of, for example, Facebook. Facebook is database culture dressed as network culture.
Yeah.
You see what I'm saying? So once you begin to identify this, then we come back to our good old friend Ethereum. Ethereum is essentially a network database. It solves many of the same problems you solve with an SQL database, but it solves them in a way that is entirely about the network rather than this kind of bureaucratic centralized data form.
Right.
Ta-da! Right? And once the network people have a database that works the way that they work, you could potentially begin to move a whole bunch of functions away from database culture to network culture, because now network culture has a database that works in a network culture way.
Right.
Yeah, it's taken me only about 4 months of hard thinking to be able to explain that in a way that made sense. This is the first time I've ever gotten that to hand together. Thank you so much for the opportunity.
Oh, that's great. We've been trying to, for the last week or so, we've been trying to ask different people to explain how Ethereum works and why it's better, and to just sort of put it into layman's terms, because so far Ethereum, the way that it's explained is very technical. For most people, it just makes their head hurt.
Yeah.
So it's really great to have that explanation, because that, it paints a good picture, I think.
And, I think it's fairly accurate at a technical level. I'm talking about the cultural factors because it's easier to understand in those ways. But when you get down to the kind of brutal bedrock technology, the Ethereum code is largely about maintaining an interconnected network and coordinating functions across the network so that everybody knows what's going on.
So what does Ethereum actually need to become widely used?
Ethereum breaks into a couple of pieces, right? So the description that I've given you so far is the description of Ethereum as a database, and as a database which is a networked database. If you can't, it's at best informal. Ethereum is an innovation, or not Ethereum, blockchains, right? Is strongly suspected it's the right thing at the right time, and here we are.
I think what interests me most about Ethereum is the effect it has on politics and culture. I mean, a lot of the guys involved in the project are very technical, but you had this interesting talk where you talked about how to sell ideas. Could you talk a bit about that and how you're kind of proposing to the team and to people involved in the Ethereum project of how to spread it?
Let's break that down into 2 parts, right? First part, impact on politics and culture. Hypothetical, speculative. Second part, how do we wake people up to the fact that this is possible? So, tell me a bit about what you think the impact on politics and culture might be. Where does that intersect with your listeners' interests?
I think decentralized voting that doesn't rely on representatives is pretty interesting to us.
Yeah, that's the most interesting thing when I think about the centralization of power and what Ethereum could do for that.
Not just voting, but even things that are somewhat decentralized, like Airbnb and Uber, they still take a high fee. Those same ecosystems could exist in Ethereum and not take an obnoxious fee and not take people's data and profit off of that.
Okay, so we're really off to the big stuff here. Well, let's break this down into layers, because the overall thing can be very overwhelming, and when it gets too big too fast, it becomes really easy to lose the thread of what's technically possible or technically credible. So we've got to go all the way back to the way that our society currently works, which is essentially SQL databases. Inside of every large organization, including the government, there is a honking great installed, usually Oracle, and anything which you could represent inside of the current scheme of the database is real, and anything you cannot represent winds up bodged together in a bunch of spreadsheets, tucked away in some office that are not within institutional reality, but have kind of grown up in the corners. And one name that's used for these is feral databases. They're understood as being this kind of cruft that grows up inside organizations to represent things that the main data core can't. That paradigm of a big centralized organization with a huge server factory that the entire institutional wisdom of the organization is trying to migrate into is the standard model for basically the entirety of Western civilization. And not just Western civilization, it's the structure of the economy. You see that across all institutions of any size anywhere in the world. It all comes down to, if you can represent it in SQL, it is real, and if you can't, it's at best informal. Ethereum is an innovation, or not Ethereum, blockchains, right? Is an innovation at roughly the same level of generality as the invention of the SQL database. It's a fundamental computing technology that, over the course of dozens of years, will become ubiquitous in some form through pretty much all computer systems. You have file, you have database, you have a blockchain, and you solve the problem at hand using a file, a database, or a blockchain, depending on the suitability of the problem for that particular storage or cooperation technology. We're talking about something that fits right alongside the core computing architecture that our civilization runs on. It's a parallel reimagining of how we use, store, and cooperate at the data level, individually and between organizations. And it goes all the way down to the lowest level of the computing stack. So there's a political movement called stacktivism that really examines a bunch of these issues in detail, started by a friend of mine, Jay Springett. Definitely have a look at stacktivism. One of the books that they really like is a thing called Seeing Like a State. And Seeing Like a State basically says, why is it that national forestries plant their trees in straight lines when it's completely terrible for the trees and doesn't produce the same kind of ecological diversity as you get when you just let a jungle grow? And the answer is, they need to be able to count the trees, because if they can't get metrics, they don't know whether they're succeeding or failing, and that means it screws up the budgeting process. So, in order for a project to get sponsored by a state, the project has to be what they call legible. It has to be visible to the organisation in a language it understands internally, otherwise it might as well not exist. And states optimise for legibility over success. And a lot of the tension that you see between libertarians and statists is around the idea that markets are illegible but efficient, whereas the state is legible but inefficient. And the place where that conversation really goes thermonuclear is, if the system is illegible, how do you know if it's fair? all the way around again, we come back to this blockchain as a fundamental sort of database type technology. Blockchains allow things which are illegible and impossible inside of the SQL database model to exist. And specifically, they allow collaborations which are impossible in the SQL database model to exist. So when you've got a single big database at the heart of your organization which stores all truth and all wisdom, you are very reluctant to let other people touch that database. You emit truth from the database and it goes through a whole bunch of hands, and then you give it to another organization, and then it goes through a whole bunch of hands and they put it in their database, and the collaboration is very, very, very indirect and very long and very complicated because nobody will let anybody else near their database. When you file a form with the IRS, it goes through 6 or 7 processes before it winds up in their databases. That makes the whole collaboration indirect, bureaucratic, difficult. It's a right pain in the ass. And so we work in a society that is formed of huge database-backed institutions that communicate with each other through very inefficient and very indirect means. And it produces this balkanization of power into these big monoliths that, generally speaking, don't cooperate well and are really hostile to users because they're just paranoid about their data. And this is the world we're in right now. Does that kind of make sense as a description of reality?
Totally.
Yeah.
All of that is being driven by the technical limitations of the SQL database. If the SQL database had been a technology that was designed around corporate